Gaudeamus omnes in Domino, diem festum celebrantes, sub honore sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers, a podcast sponsored by CatholicCulture.org. I'm your host, Mike Aquilina. Our travels today take us to the region in southwestern France that borders Spain, the city today known as Bordeaux. In ancient times, the province was Gaul, the region Aquitania, and the city Bertigala. There, around 35, a boy named Paulinus was born to an aristocratic senatorial family. By bloodline, he was destined to do great things in the service of the empire, and from his early years he was educated for that purpose. If you've read the epics of Homer and Virgil, you know that rulers and warriors and diplomats in those days were expected to have training in the rhetorical arts. They were expected to excel in the giving of speeches, the techniques of debate, and even the composition of poetry. For these skills, Paulinus studied under the great master of his day. His name was Ausonius. Ausonius is known to posterity primarily as a poet, but he, like Paulinus, came from the noble class and served the empire at the highest levels. He was tutor to the future Emperor Gratian, and he later occupied the highest elected office in the empire, the consulship. Paulinus may have been Ausonius's star pupil. Like his master, he excelled in the writing of poems, and he was fascinated by the fine points of poetic technique. He committed many classic works to memory, and he scrutinized the ancients for their forms, meters, and methods. These were a particular passion of both Paulinus and Ausonius. Paulinus revered his teacher, and looked to him as a model of statesmanship and poetic art. Ausonius, for his part, considered Paulinus his pride and joy, and his most likely successor as the Western Empire's most revered poet. We have only a handful of poems from young Paulinus, and they fulfill the duties of aristocratic etiquette. One is a brief expression of gratitude for gifts sent by a fellow nobleman. Another is a letter in verse composed to accompany a gift. Paulinus followed after Ausonius in civil service. At around the age of 20, he moved to Rome to succeed his father in the Senate. Shortly afterward, he was elected consul, and after he served his term, the Senate assigned him to be governor of Campania in Italy. It was there that he experienced an awakening of faith. We know nothing about his religious upbringing, but his family was probably at least nominally Christian. In Campania, however, Paulinus was moved by the deep devotion of the local people to the memory of Saint Felix, a saint of the 3rd century who had suffered under the persecution of Decius or Valerian. On his feast day every year, pilgrims thronged to venerate his tomb, and some experienced miracles. Young Paulinus felt that Felix was interceding for him and intervening in his life. In one of the many poems he dedicated to the saint, he said, "It was you who prompted incidents to effect my salvation. Rejoicing in your light, I loved Christ." Paulinus vowed that he would improve the conditions at the tomb of St. Felix. He built a hostel there for pilgrims and paved a road that led to the tomb. He pledged also that he would eventually make Nola his permanent home. While governor, Paulinus adopted St. Felix as his special patron. To Felix, he attributed his ability to avoid the shedding of human blood, that is, the use of capital punishment, which he believed would have endangered his soul. His career in public service, however, was not to last long. The young Emperor Gratian was assassinated in 383, and Paulinus fell into disfavor. He was not yet 30 years old. So he began his long trip home to Gaul. His intention was probably to live a life of leisure on his family property, writing poems as the spirit moved him. He had a model for this in his teacher Ausonius. Along the way home, he spent time with Ambrose of Milan and Martin of Tours, and his faith deepened from these encounters. He had a warm personality and made friends easily. Among his friends, he counted Augustine of Hippo, Sulpicius Severus, Rufinus of Aquileia, and so many other luminaries of his age. He was also on good terms with the heretics Pelagius and Julian of Aquilina. Paulinus sustained his friendships through rich correspondence. It was one of his letters, it seems, that provoked Augustine to write his great memoir, the Confessions. Back home in Gaul, Paulinus married Thracia, a devout woman of his social class. This momentous event was followed by a series of traumas and calamities. His brother died, and Paulinus was accused of murdering him. Some historians believe this was an attempt to confiscate Paulinus's property. The time would have been opportune for such a move. Paulinus was weakened politically since the death of Gratian, his patron. He was vulnerable. He and Thracia moved to Spain, where they took consolation in the expectation of their first child. Even this, however, turned to grief as their son died at the age of 8 days. Paulinus and Thracia decided to make a radical change in their lives. They pledged to go forward living together as celibates, dedicating their life to prayer and charitable service. They sold off a substantial portion of their estates, their lands, their groves, and their magnificent villas. The news spread throughout the empire. Imagine what would happen today if a tech mogul or movie star suddenly announced the intention to give away his fortune and enter a monastery. Word reached Milan, and Ambrose rejoiced. So did Martin in Tours, and Augustine in North Africa. In Bertigala, however, Ausonius was not pleased at all. In fact, he kind of freaked out. He cast long letters in metrical verse to his former student, pleading with him not to go forward with his plan. Ausonius was also a Christian, but he showed little understanding of the monastic movement that was then just beginning to spread in the Western Church. He treated Paulinus's contempt for the world as a species of insanity. Understandably, he was most concerned about Paulinus's poetry. Here was the greatest poet of the passing generation, now an old man, standing helpless as the greatest poet he knew in the next generation appeared to be abandoning the art. Paulinus acknowledged in response that his aesthetic values had changed, but he had no plans to stop writing. He wrote to Ausonius, "Though I use the poet's art, the song I sing will not be invented. I shall tell it with an historian's truthfulness and without the poet's deceit. Because a servant of Christ should not utter lies, our sole technique is faith, and our art of song is Christ." Ausonius's poems had touched incidentally on Christian faith. They affirmed the doctrine of the Nicene Creed when it was under attack. But Ausonius was also willing to work with traditional Roman myth and celebrate the empire's pre-Christian history. One of his famous poems is dedicated to a young slave girl who was his mistress. He was also capable of writing frankly erotic verse in the style of the ancient Roman wedding songs. It's not surprising that his most sexually explicit work, his Cento Nuptialis, is his poem most often discussed today. Well, Paulinus was clearly moving in a different direction. And yet, it's not really true that his sole technique was faith. Paulinus was a deeply conservative poet. He was a man of his class, and he was educated in the tradition of Roman verse by a man who was fanatically devoted to that tradition. Paulinus had mastered the techniques and forms of the Roman tradition, and now he bent them to new ends. To the cultured ears of his fellow aristocrats, the rhythms and phrases of his poems suggested Virgil, Horace, and Ovid. In fact, the letters that Paulinus wrote to Ausonius were written in verse that his master praised as perfect and beyond his power to improve. Ausonius conceded that Paulinus's skill had far surpassed his own. Paulinus was consciously adapting traditional Latin genres to commemorate new themes. He wrote a marriage song, for example, but it was nothing like that of Ausonius. In fact, it included lines of praise for chastity and even a hope that the couple's children would be called to celibacy. Paulinus also wrote a poem of mourning, again following an ancient Roman form. Yet in his Christian hands, the poem is not an unrelenting lament. Instead, it resolves in the hope of heaven. In yet another instance, he wrote a poem bidding farewell to a guest. Once more, this was a custom in polite society. But for Paulinus, it concludes not with a wish for safe travel, but a hope for reunion in the afterlife. But the Latin form he adopted most profitably was the birthday poem. He wrote 14 of these, all of them dedicated to St. Felix, and he read them aloud each year, not on the day the saint was born, but rather on the anniversary of his death, his birth to eternal life. These are the poems that won him renown, and they're filled with colorful detail, not only about the saint's life, but also about current events and local doings in the little town of Nola. In his 8th birthday poem, for example, he faces the challenge of celebrating a feast during a time of extreme duress. It was the year 401, and the Goths under Alaric were devastating Italy. So Paulinus asked for Felix's intercession on behalf of his people to bring about a better future. In the early 20th century, it was translated by Athelstan Riley and sung as an English hymn. Another year completed, the day comes round once more, which with our patron's radiance is bright as heretofore. Now strong in hope united, his festival we greet. He will present our troubles before the mercy seat. The scriptures tell how Moses did for the people pray, appeased the judge eternal, and turned his wrath away. Elijah's prayer had power to close and open heaven. Such saints as were aforetime, such saints to us are given. O saint of God beloved, and placed on his right hand, thy prayers be like a rampart, as 'gainst the foe we stand. For Abraham's God is thy God, and Isaac's God is thine. Thine is the God of Jacob, the Lord of power benign. For 40 years his Israel he fed with angels' food. The flinty rock he opened, the streams of water flowed. Entreat that Christ his people may lead to victory. The God of Joshua's triumph, the Lord thy God is he. Paulinus the traditionalist was now in the avant-garde of a new poetics. This was something his teacher Ausonius could not understand, and he went to his death disconsolate for what he calculated as a loss. But Paulinus worked nonetheless to salvage their friendship, and with his characteristic warmth, he paid tribute to his teacher and his lasting influence. In a famous passage in one of his verse letters, he told him so. And here it is in the translation of Helen Waddell. I, through all chances that are given to mortals, and through all fates that be, so long as this close prison shall contain me, yea, though a world shall sunder me and thee, thee shall I hold in every fibre woven. Not with dumb lips, nor with averted face, shall I behold thee in my mind, embrace thee, instant and present, thou in every place. Yea, when the prison of this flesh is broken, and from the earth I shall have gone my way, wheresoe'er in the wide universe I stay me, there shall I bear thee as I do today. Think not the end that from my body frees me, breaks and unshackles from my love to thee. Triumphs the soul above its house in ruin, deathless, begot of immortality. Still must she keep her senses and affections, hold them as dear as life itself to be. Could she choose death, then might she choose forgetting, living, remembering to eternity. In Nola, close to the tomb of St. Felix, Paulinus and Thrasea used the remains of their fortunes to establish monasteries for men and women. Their charity won them renown, and in time became the stuff of legends. Around the year 409, Paulinus was ordained bishop of Nola, and he served in that office for more than 20 years. He is known to posterity for his poetry and his friendships. Whether there can be a better legacy is a debatable point. Join us next time for another poet of the 5th century, another Latin poet from the provinces. His name is Prudentius. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider making a contribution for the continuation of our series. The Way of the Fathers is listener-funded, so we're dependent on the generosity of people like you. Please pay us a visit at catholicculture.org/donate/audio and leave us a note if you love the Fathers. We pray for our benefactors every day.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is just one of the podcasts produced by CatholicCulture.org. To hear more from the Church Fathers in their own words, check out Catholic Culture audiobooks, readings of Catholic classics, including the Fathers and St. John Henry Newman. You might also enjoy Criteria, the Catholic film podcast, devoted to works of high artistic caliber and Catholic interest. And for interviews on a wide range of topics in Catholic arts and culture, listen to the Catholic Culture podcast.